I feel like talking, but I don't feel like playing. I'm watching a video right now that reminded me of the 1990s Desert Storm, Desert Shield before it. And immediately, you know, to my mind comes the situation in Ukraine comparatively, right? Now, there are, many reasons for differences, right? For one thing, Saddam didn't actually have any kind of weapons of mass destruction of any kind, and certainly not at the level that Russia does, although there are some questions as to how effective they would be. But even some, even some nukes would be a terrible, terrible thing. But a lot more of it goes to considering the foreign policy sort of thought mode within the U.S. At the time of the Iraq War, the first one, the foreign policy was very, very robust, very muscular. They basically, we were the unipower in a lot of ways, and we're not anymore. Russia is not on the same level, though. But there is a balance. We've allowed China to grow into a real threat. Now, I don't know, allowed is kind of a weird word. That's an odd situation in and of itself, because in a lot of ways, we encouraged China to become a more capable country under the hopes of, the trade and whatnot, opening up, free trade with them and investing in technology and whatnot, and allowing our corporations to be heavily, heavily embedded there. So some of the thought was the interlinkages would make it impossible for there, to be a war type situation, and some of it was that, their society, their politics would actually liberalize due to, the good effects of a stronger economy. Well, that all seemed to be working until she came in. And yeah. One has to remember, it's not like, Germany, for example, had a history prior to Nazism coming into play of being closed and isolated and all that. It's quite possible for even a fairly affluent. Now, China's a weird state because you could say the same about Russia, but it's weird compared to, say, the Western European states, in that there is sort of an affluent upper class present, and India, the same kind of thing. But things are not sort of as egalitarian as what we're used to. But in Germany, you didn't even have that. You had what was really a modern Western European nation state at the time. Anyway, it just proved that, we kind of allowed them to bootstrap themselves perhaps a lot faster, get their economy kick-started and working a lot harder. And whatever we were hoping would come from that kind of reversed. And you could say the same with Russia, right? At least in the 90s, there was kind of this hope that Russia, would become this, again, a more liberal and democratic and economically tied into everything else, and what happened instead was a kleptocracy. But there were signs very early that things were going very wrong in Russia. And, you know, we kind of didn't take the right steps there to make, you know, going from Glasnost to the fall of the Warsaw Pact and then the fall of the USSR all happened very quickly. And kind of like the feelings with the Arab Spring and all that, there was kind of this, you know, exuberant hopefulness that things will all work out great. And that took a turn to the dark and the ugly very, very quickly. And the U.S. didn't really do anything about that. I don't know who to blame. I think most of it lies starting with Clinton, to tell you the truth. That, you know, there was this hope that, like, that kind of polarization of the world was just not going to be anymore. But you kind of get the feeling that that hope was inherited from the previous Republican administrations as well. And then it got kind of its worst moment when Putin started, you know, when he took power and started showing his hand a little bit as not really a good guy at all. You know, before him, Yeltsin was like kind of a buffoon and horrible things were happening under him. Putin kind of solidified his hold on stuff, right? And I mean, he got into power because Yeltsin was so corrupt and so bad. But you have this, you had W. Bush, you know, with his, I looked into his soul and I said he was a good man. You know, and we keep having that happening, right? You know, I mean, after Bush finally started getting burned enough times with Georgia and whatnot, then you had Obama and Hillary Clinton coming in with sort of the whole reset and everything, and everything went to shit again. You know, I mean, at some point you got to learn this guy's not a good actor on the world stage, and you can't hope for anything decent out of him. But I was reflecting more on you know, how we just, as soon as there was this so obvious, right? So I'm going to argue that Kuwait and Ukraine are both significant, important areas of interest in the world for the U.S. Much more so than many other places that we might actually ignore, places like Georgia. And, you know, obviously oil supply has a special case, but there's oil in Ukraine. So, not as much as there is a little further east, but and what's more is there's sort of the mystique around, you know, changing the borders in Europe, right? This is a place where World War II and World War I were fought over the borders, and we should know enough now that that's just not the way to go about things. And, you know, we can kind of say, okay, the collapse of Yugoslavia and the wars that came out of that, but they were all minor. They were all sort of proxy wars being handled. Here we had a situation where, you know, the Russians just went in and seized territory with Crimea, and seized territory, well, and started their own insurrection, funneling their own forces into the Donbass and whatnot. But there's, if you think back just the reaction in the Kuwait situation. Not only did the U.S. immediately yeah, this is horrible, but they also went about immediately getting a world consensus on it. And something like half the world joined the coalition of the willing there or whatever. I don't remember if that was Pappy Bush's term or Junior. But clearly, as the unipower, but also, look, I think Saddam had a larger army than the U.S. did, but that's irrelevant. In terms of military capabilities and whatnot, it was just, there was no comparison there. I think Saddam had the third largest army in the world, though, because I remember making a little joke to myself, or making a little joke. Yeah, we had the fourth largest army in the world, and we wanted to go up a notch. It's funny because that war was the only time, other than in high school when I was trying to figure out what the fuck I'm going to do with my life, when I seriously considered joining the military. And I was still young enough at that point where I could have gotten in, and by a good deal, and there was just this feeling of, this is just the most it's just this serious land grab type situation of a type that seemed like it had gone obsolete. I mean, even in the Cold War, you didn't see land grabs like that. It was generally, there was an already existing struggle. So if you look at Vietnam or Korea, there were continuing situations because of the decline of colonialism and the idea of do you have a communist anti-colonial insurgency, or do you have an inheritor state that is dependent on the West still to exist, type of situation. But here you had just a simple out-and-out land grab. And I'm trying to think, where else did you have such things? You had disputed territory between India and Pakistan. But I'm trying to think of anything else where somebody just went in and grabbed a hunk of somebody's country without, before, looking back as far as World War II, right? Until after that, the post-World War II era, it just didn't tend to happen. I may be missing some, there may be, certainly I think there were some in Africa. But again, Africa feels unsettled in a lot of ways, in that they hadn't gone through everything. And out of all places, the Middle East is kind of the place where the lines were drawn due to colonialism, with very little consideration of what of what they might need in the future, and it was just, that's much of the problems that we have there, is we have these places that do not have claims really on the territory per se, because they didn't exist as countries, but they have reasons to support, portions of the population there. So, for example, Iran has great interest in Iraq, so you have that kind of problem. Wasn't it Iraq that started the Iran-Iraq war, though? Oil. I have held that, if you look at, Islam's 500 years and a little younger than Christianity. And if you kind of think about it, 500 years ago, wow, we're looking at some really nasty times in terms of in terms of conflicts between Christian nations and whatnot. You're looking at the wars of religion and the 30 Years' War and all that. I don't know if that analog holds up at all, but if you just move the date 500 years, it's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense that the Arab world is in so much trouble at this point. But where were we wandering? Yeah, so I don't know if a lot of people felt the same kind of visceral reaction that I did in terms of wanting to sign up for that war. I didn't feel anything of the sort. And I think I might have still been able to enlist. I don't remember what the age is on that. I'm thinking for the post 9/11, which when I would say, yeah, the Gulf War, that was the one that made me want to go join the army. And most people I would talk to were thinking, when I'd say something like that, would be thinking about, after 9/11 or whatever. And no, not that, really the immediate after effects was going into Afghanistan. I don't think many people signed up for that, like, let's go invade Iraq again. Let's finish what we started there. Yeah, that was a royal mess. But one of the things that's happened in between was those wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the second Iraq war, where the U.S. really kind of got itself stuck in situations that were not at all good. And, we entered, in the Afghanistan war, it went forever. It was our longest war. And, just this constant drain without any real sign that there was any hope or anything. We got ourselves out of Iraq, but I can't say that, we should be happy with the results of that. And then there was also the simple fact that we entered on false pretexts that we probably knew were there. And so we got a real bloody nose, both with our own population and with the world at large for the latter one, which I think is a large part of why you saw what were really weak reactions to the Russian seizure of Crimea by Obama. Now, again, obviously, you can't do a Kuwait-type war against Russia, right? You can't just sweep in with everything. And there were certainly sanctions. I think Hillary Clinton was a little bit more on the hawkish side than Obama was on that. I feel like the State Department did more to try and, to begin with, they were involved in trying to destabilize and helping democratic, pro-Western forces within Ukraine to topple the government there. Not to any horrible extent, right? But cutting bare what, that government in Ukraine was like, what the Belarusian government is probably like, what Putin's government is like, right? These just horrible kleptocracies that formed in certain of the East European former USSR states really kind of shined a light, and it's like, wow, that's really not what we stand for. And much more telling it's not what the people there wanted. You know, they felt like when they got detached, you know, when the USSR collapsed, there was this feeling of freedom throughout that whole world. And then a sort of an unrestrained, unregulated type of capitalism, which, of course, you know, leads to a kleptocracy, right? You know, if you don't have a rule of law in place that governs over the economics, well, the true economics of capitalism is money is power and power is money, and the two can be interchanged, right? And you can't let yourself be weakened in either of those. But yeah, I feel like there was this big retrenchment especially after Iraq. But you know, Afghanistan was incredibly fatiguing to the nation as well, and led us to a point where, you know, a candidate who came in saying we don't start stupid wars and stuff like that really wasn't in a great position to show the kind of, you know, muscular intervention that I would say that both the Bushes and the Clinton were willing to involve themselves into. And honestly, that everyone from Truman on was willing to involve themselves in to some degree. You know, the question was, and you know, people look to Carter as being particularly weak or whatever. Carter was a really strong defense hawk and very much in the anti-capitalist mode. The only thing was he wasn't willing to he didn't see that the ends justified the means in the same way that many others would have. And in fact, you would have to actually kind of argue that Nixon was the weaker on communism in a lot of ways. He was the one, and it's hard to tell, Ford was there for so short a time, but he was the one who not only opened up China, but also was constantly kind of bending over backwards in certain ways. Although willing to, you know, for him it was like, yeah, the ends are my political ends. But anyway, when you get to when you get to the Obama reaction, it wasn't sufficient. I don't know what would have been, and part of the problem is the world wasn't with us either. The world wasn't with us, and sure, the Western European countries and everything. Yeah, it was a horrible thing that Crimea was seized. But, you know, there was a major base there for the Russians. And, you know, the government did topple and change rapidly. And, you know, Russia did give Crimea to the Ukraine, sort of, kind of. But there's also the simple fact that both the US and Russia had guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity. And then Russia goes and seizes part of it. I think the reaction to that should have been greater. And then you get to an equally weak reaction to the overall outright invasion of Ukraine by Biden. And, okay, you know, yeah, he tried to mobilize and actually got a good deal of support behind trying to support them. But it was the U.S. that was always putting the brakes on what equipment could be given. And not just, I mean, we were putting the brakes on what other people should give as well, from what I understand. And a real opportunity was lost there. And it may be too late at this point. But when, you know, the Russians were retreating back from Kiev, things looked really like it was time to throw a big intervention in. Not a military intervention, but just up the ante in terms of the kind of sanctions we were putting, which weren't all that effective, but also the support that we were willing to throw in. If we were willing to throw in even a fraction of what we threw into the Kuwait War, in terms of just economic force and lending military equipment or giving military equipment, however you want to put it, that would have strengthened the position greatly. And we might not have a Putin anymore at that point. So that's kind of a sad situation. What's harder to tell is the Trump years, because Russia was unwilling to escalate during the early Trump, the first Trump term. They continued their operations, but they didn't just plunge right in. And that gave Ukraine time to build up, etc., although they were constantly fighting on in the eastern attempts to break away. But it feels almost like the question is, how much of that is Trump and how much of that is like the people he had in his cabinet and the Mitch McConnell Senate and stuff like that, that were like, yeah, this is really a very cost-effective way to drain the shit out of Russia. And, to make them pay for what they're doing. Well, the strongest of the possibilities is what I was putting forward, which was the, hey, if we had intervened heavily when when those armored columns started running back and turned tail, that would have, been a bear trap. It would have been like Afghanistan was for the Soviet Union. And for us, it would have been terrible. Instead, what we've gotten is this horrible trench warfare going on that's not enough to drain Russia. And if anything, it might be enough of a sign, especially if we start to weaken our stance at all, of to Xi that I invade Taiwan. There'll be a couple of years that might be a little painful, but we'll get over it. We'll get over it. I don't know. Anyway, I just wanted to throw some thoughts out there. My battery's almost dead, and I could come up with more thoughts, there's no question, but just felt like chatting.